1. Okay, we are live for another Q&A, and we have Karl Gruner back for another one because the last one was so great. Karl was a former F-111 and F-16 pilot, but Karl, can you just give us a brief overview of your flying career, just in case people haven't seen the interviews we did together?
Yeah, so for those who haven't seen my previous, there are several videos with Mike on this channel from, I guess, the past 2, 3 years. And first of all, I was born and raised in France, which is kind of unusual for a U.S. Air Force pilot. But my father was in the U.S. Army, so I ended up eventually moving to the U.S. Went through Air Reserve Officer Training Corps in California, and then went into the Air Force. Went to pilot training, and ended up flying first the F-111 for about 6 years and almost 1,000 hours. Not quite, just under. And then after a ground tour with the Army, I ended up flying the F-16 for about a total of 4 years in Germany and in Korea at Kunsan Air Base. So that's my basic background.
Brilliant
So,
stuff. So guys, get your questions coming for Karl. We're going to go on for 1 hour in this Q&A, but Karl, as you can see, they're coming in, so I'm going to let you loose, and guys, enjoy this one.
yeah, so some of these questions were preloaded, so I've already taken a look at it. The first one is from Andrew, and it is, which accelerated from 250 knots to Mach 1 at low level better, the F-111 or F-16? Now it's not an easy question to answer because I have actually never, I've never timed it one or the other formally. But obviously from 250 to about 500 or maybe 550 knot, the F-16 would be faster for sure. Much higher thrust to weight ratio. Now the question is above that. I believe at some point, and I don't know exactly what that speed would be, but at some point the F-111 would start accelerating faster. But the total time, I don't know. It might be pretty close, particularly for an F model F-111. As most of you know, the F model had way more thrust than, let's say, the A model, which I started flying first. And then I transitioned to the F model at Lakenheath, which had about 40% more thrust. So that was way faster accelerating. And I would say to Mach 1, it'd be tough. It'd be pretty close. But if you're looking at like from 250 to Mach 1.2 or higher at low altitude, I would say probably the F-111 would be faster overall. Although again, initially the F-16 would accelerate faster, but then maybe the F-111 would catch up at some point. Hard to say. The next question from Bikeender 2002. Oh, Bike Rider, sorry, Bike Rider 2002. Did the F-111 feel sluggish to fly? No, not at all. You would think maybe because it's a pretty big, it's fighter, quotation marks, more like a bomber, as many people have pointed out. But it was capable of pulling 7.3 Gs, although you couldn't do that at full gross weight. Obviously, you had to wait till the fuel level was down. I can't remember exactly what, but I did it quite a few times, pulling 7 Gs. And particularly coming off on the functional check flights off the North Sea and climbing from doing our terrain following radar checks at low altitude, and then having to climb to do some engine checks at a higher altitude. I would often pull like 7 Gs at from about 600 knots or so at low altitude, and then climb up to 24,000 feet or very quickly. And so, but okay, the G's is not the only thing. As far as feeling, the roll rate was quite fast. The overall handling was very nimble for an airplane like this, so it was not sluggish. Now, part of this was because it depended on on flight control computers that it was called a stability augmentation system that actually enhanced the flying characteristics artificially through computers. If you turned off these computers, which we actually did practice occasionally, you would turn off the pitch, roll, and yaw dampers. You had a switch for each one of those. You could turn them off individually or all at once. And if you did that, you had some pretty restrictive airspeed and G limitations and bank angle limitations. And then the airplane became indeed very, very sluggish. Now it was still good enough to fly and approach and land it, but you had to be way more careful in that instance. And we did practice that occasionally, but with the flight control computers on, it's actually pretty amazing how nimble the aircraft was for its size. So in that sense, it was definitely more like a fighter than a bomber. The only big limitation is if you start pulling a lot of G's, the airspeed would bleed off very, very fast. And also that the corner velocity was pretty high. So like to pull 7 G's, you had to be going at least like probably 500. I can't remember the exact figure, but something like 500 knots. Whereas in the F-16, you could pull 9 G's like 350 knots, like maybe even slightly less. But overall, no, definitely not sluggish. Let's see. Next question. Well, I've got a slight technical problem. There's a pop-up that came up. Anyway, and because of this, I'm unable to see the next question. But if I remember well, the question is this thing. I can't read who wrote the question, but the question had to do with whether I ever tangled in the F-16 against RAF aircraft.
Yes.
And my answer is no, not formally anyway. No, I never flew a formal DACT sortie against Royal Air Force fighters of any kind, unfortunately. But at low altitude, flying in Germany and various low-fly areas, you would encounter all kinds of aircraft. Other U.S. Air Force aircraft, of course, but German aircraft, French aircraft, occasionally, but mostly RAF Germany aircraft like Tornadoes, Jaguars, F4s. This, again, we're talking about the late 1980s there. So this is pre-typhoon era. And in that sense, yes, we did encounter some of them, but these were very limited combat. We would be limited to a reaction turn of no more than 180 degrees turn, and then we have to rock your wings, basically knocking it off. Now, some countries, especially, I think I've talked about this, the Canadians, especially in the RF-18s, were definitely, they wanted to do a lot more than that, but we usually obeyed by the rules. And the other thing, the other restriction is you could not use afterburner in Germany below 3,000 feet above ground level. So that would also be a severe limitation as far as doing an actual dogfight. So the general answer is really no. I did not do that. So next question from Biggles Tintin. And by the way, I'm very familiar with Biggles and Tintin. So just as an aside, but growing up, this was some of the books I would read, some of the stuff I was very familiar with. But during your time serving in the USAFE in England, which were your favorite areas for low-level flying? And a more personal level, what were the things that you liked and disliked about living in England? Well, let's address the second one first. I loved my time, my 3 years at Lake and East. I just loved it. I mean, this was 1983 to 1986. Of course, some of the favorite things were the language was a little bit different, but okay, not too different. And you got used to it very fast. There were still some accents initially, especially like Scottish accents and Welsh accents that were very difficult to understand. But I picked it up pretty quick. Watched a lot of English British TV and such. And what I really liked is a lot of the culture. I was stationed at Lakenheath, so I was very close to Cambridge, for example, fantastic city, and not far from London. And we would go to London on a very regular basis, and just love the culture, the shows, the museums, the shopping, just absolutely great. The people were great. One of the things, of course, that people remark is how fond the British are of aviation in general. Probably a relic from Battle of Britain days, and the fact that the RAF maybe arguably maybe saved England over a few months in 1940. And so the people there are very fun, like at air shows. They're very interested in aviation. So I really appreciated that as well. The food, of course, was not, English food doesn't have the reputation for the best in the world. But on the other hand, you had access to all kinds of other types of food. And even then, that was not a big deal for me. Of course, getting used to driving on the wrong side of the road. Oh, sorry, the left side of the road was a factor. But again, you got used to that pretty quick. And I ended up buying a car with a right-hand drive, so the steering wheel on the right hand, and I got used to that pretty fast. With a stick shift, so I had to shift with my left hand, which again took just a short time to get used to. But overall, I thought it was great. I just loved it. Now, it was a hard time initially for me because I was getting a divorce from my first wife, and but on the other hand, I was in a very early portion of that stay, and then she moved back to the U.S. And then I ended up having several British girlfriends, and they were all great. And I only have good things to say about my stay in the UK. So I hope that answers the question. So the first part of the question was best low flying. Pretty much anywhere. I mean, we used to go to Scotland more than anything anywhere else. In the F-111, we had the range to do that and stay low level in Scotland for a very long time. Our average sortie duration was about 2.5 hours without air refueling, including at least an hour at low level. That was no problem at all. And but we flew a lot of other places as well. I've done like the White Cliffs of Dover's. In Wales was also a very common area to go fly into. But I would say Scotland, because it was much bigger than Wales and offered more possibilities for various low-level routes and so on, was probably our favorite area to go to. There were also some bombing range in Scotland on the north coast. I remember Rose Hardy Range, and I think it was it Tain Range, close to Lossiemouth. Anyway, that we used quite often. And so I would say Scotland overall was our favorite area to go to. Just because it was less populated, there was less obstructions, there was more room to do whatever we wanted. And of course, there was the famous Loch Ness run. So, all right. The next question from Freckle Punny, I guess, so Pooney. Hi, Karl. Having flown both the F-111 and the F-16, could the F-16XL have been a replacement for the F-111 in the way the F-15E pretty much did? Or was it wishful thinking? No, it would have been a great replacement. There were some pros and cons. Eventually, the F-15E ended up getting that contract, and it wasn't a bad choice. The F-16XL would have had some advantages over the F-15E, but you can argue either way. I thought it would have been cool to actually see the F-16XL in operation, but obviously the disadvantage, single engine. I don't think being single engine is such a huge disadvantage to me. most fighters in history have been single engine historically. Obviously, there is an advantage in peacetime, especially being two engine. But on the other hand, two engine aircraft tend to cost more. Um, uh, I think the F-16 XL probably would have had a lower radar cross section than an F-15E, but that's pure speculation on my part. Um, and it was just a cool looking aircraft. And actually, on the same subject, I think the Air Force should have bought what was called at the time the FB-22 version of the F-22, which was kind of a cranked arrow delta version of the F-22. And I think that would have been a superb replacement for the F-111 and the F-15E. But of course, it never happened. So, but overall, there's no right answer to that question. I don't know, because it's kind of speculation, but it would have been cool to see it in action. So, let's see. The next question. Let's see. We've got Chelsea Dagger. Hi, did you enjoy the side-by-side seating in the F-111? Well, it had its pros and cons. I mean, it was easier to do crew coordination with your Wizzo as opposed to the Wizzo sitting in your back, and that was the same idea for the side-by-side seating in the A6 Intruder, by the way. But the A6 Intruder was a little bit better designed from that point of view, because the Wizzo, well, they would call it a Bombardier Navigator, or BN, as opposed to a Wizzo back then. But their seat was a little bit behind and a little bit lower than the pilot seat, and also the A6 Intruder had a little bit more of a bubble canopy to it, so it wasn't as big of a problem. But obviously, the side-by-side seating, the main problem was the visibility for the pilot to the right side, especially right and rear. So let's say anything aft of the 3 o'clock position was a huge problem, and you had to rely on the Wizzo to clear that part. And of course, the Wizzo often was very busy looking in the radar, or in the F-111F in the PAVTAC pod video. So that was definitely a disadvantage. And overall, I would say, if given the choice, even though there were advantages for crew coordination, I would prefer a tandem seating under a bubble canopy. That would be vastly preferable, in my opinion. But again, it wasn't all negative. Let's see. Next one, again from Freckle Pooney. How do you think the Tornado and the Su-24, the Fencer, compared to the F-111 in terms of mission capability? Yeah, that's a good one. Obviously, the Su-24 is a little bit closer to the F-111 in configuration and size and mission, although it is a little smaller than the F-111, but it's much closer. The Tornado obviously has way shorter range than the F-111 ever had, even with external tanks. It's not comparable, and also did not carry as much in terms of armament. So from that point of view, the F-111 was much better. Tornado more maneuverable, although again, it's definitely more closer to a fighter in terms of a maneuverability, even though it's not exactly an F-16, but Tornado would be definitely better in that sense. As far as the terrain following capability, they were essentially, the Tornado's terrain following radar was an evolved version of the F-111's system, built by the same company. And the main difference is, in the F-111 we had a redundant system, so if one of them failed, we had a backup. We had two radars for the terrain following system, and they were interchangeable, and one was just a backup to the other. Whereas in the Tornado, it was only one system. However, it was a more advanced system, which was, I think, more reliable. So, I guess it was a trade-off. But I don't know. And again, I would say the Tornado had the advantage. We just talked about this. The tandem seating, in my opinion, probably was better overall as far as visibility and keeping track of what's going on, situation awareness, visual situation awareness. So I would give the advantage to the Tornado. The Su-24, of course, had side by side, or has, still in service. So side by side seating. They've taken quite a lot of losses on both sides of the Ukraine-Russia war. And it's probably it's more comparable to the capabilities of the F-111, but still has shorter range and less weapons carrying capability. And when you talk about the F-111 with a paved tack system, the forward-looking infrared and laser designation system, I don't think the Su-24 ever has had a system that's as capable in that respect. So the Russians are still overall, even with their newer system like the Su-34, they're still behind the Western systems in terms of precision guidance for air-to-ground weapons. So which is kind of remarkable, but it's still a fact. I mean, they've made a lot of progress, but we're still way ahead of where they are. So I hope that's enough to answer the question here. Next one. That's Griffin 14. What airplane camouflage was really effective and which one was really ineffective? Well, that kind of depends on whether you're talking air to ground or air to air. Obviously, in air to ground, and also, by the way, what area of the world you're flying in. So for air to air, it doesn't make as much difference. The gray camouflage on the F-16 was extremely effective, and it overall was the best compromise for masking the airplane in both air to air and air to ground by far. I mean, now it's hard, and that's why like later on in the F-111's life, they did go to a gray overall camouflage. Now I never flew an F-111 in that livery because I left the F-111 in 1986, and we still had the Vietnam era / European, more European like green and sandy camouflage, which was quite good at low altitude in Europe. Obviously, in a desert background like in Desert Storm, the British painted their airplanes, the Jaguars and the Tornadoes, for air to ground in a sort of like a sandy pink camouflage, which I guess was more effective against that background at low altitude. But again, since a lot of the F-111's missions were flown at night anyway, that's a moot point. At night, it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, I suppose the best would be black. And by the way, the undersides of the F-111 were painted black. So that was because we did fly a lot at night. So that's the logic behind painting the underside of the F-111 black. Later on, they went to a more like a darkish gray camouflage, which overall, as a compromise between lowering the visual signature at higher altitudes and at lower altitudes, that probably is the best, I would say. I tell you, the F-16 was it was very effective, the F-15 gray scheme. But of course, I'm a little biased because the F-16 is also a lot smaller. So that was also a factor as to why it was much harder to see on overall. So let's see. Now we get to Joe and MD777. Hello, Karl. Did you fly the Block 30 GE motor? Yes. With a big inlet. I did that at Kunsan. So in Germany, I flew the Block 25, which had the original Pratt & Whitney F100 engine. Although later on they were upgraded to the 220 engine, which had a digital flight control. Not flight control, but engine control system, which made it a little bit better. And the Block 20. His next part of the question is: do you like it more as opposed to the Pratt-powered Block 25? Yes. Overall, the big mouth Block 30, which I flew at Kunsan, was definitely there was a definite increase in power and acceleration in sustained G. Now, there was a little bit of a trade-off because the big mouth had more drag. So the faster you went, the less that difference was noticeable. And I guess above a certain speed, like a super high Mach, it's possible the Block 25 would have had an advantage. Although when I say that, I'm not 100% sure because I never did a straight side-by-side comparison of both. So, but definitely at the lower speeds, lower altitude, the Block 30 was noticeably more powerful, and that did make a difference. So like when I would do like a maximum performance takeoff, which was not all that often. I mean, usually they did that on functional check flights, but like sometimes during incentive rides where we fly a two-seater and give what they would call an incentive ride to like some of our best crew chiefs or other maintenance people or other people that were deserving and had earned the right to get a ride in the backseat of an F-16. Typically on those, we would do a maximum performance takeoff. And on the Block 25, you kind of had to keep the power up for a while after you put the gear up and keep it down until you reach like 400, 450 knots towards the end of the runway to start doing that maximum performance climb. In the Block 30, you could just put the gear up, and actually you couldn't wait too long to put the gear up because you if you did wait too long, you might exceed the maximum gear down speed, and which, if I remember well, was 300 knots. But yeah, I think was it 250? No, memory fails. I guess I could get my flight manual out, but I'm not gonna waste time here. Anyway, in the Block 30, you could basically suck the gear up and start climbing right away, and the airplane would accelerate. No, of course, in a totally clean configuration, that is, no external tanks or anything. But if you were lucky to do that with a clean airplane, you could pretty much accelerate straight up. As long as the temperature wasn't too high or anything like this, because obviously engine performance depends highly on pressure, altitude, and temperature. So next is Ed Eduwork. Hi, Karl. Did you fly the Libya raid mission? I think we've addressed that before. No, I was at Lakenheath when the mission happened, but I was only like 3 weeks away or something like this from leaving Lakenheath for my ground tour with the Army, and I did not fly on the mission. Now, of course, I knew everybody that went on there, including the two heroes that gave their life during the mission, Fernando Ribas Dominici and Paul Lawrence, his Wizzo, that did not come back. But I had flown with both of them earlier, at Lakenheath, and a very sad story. So I don't want to belabor this. But no, the short answer, I did not go on the mission. But of course, I got to talk to a lot of people that did later on, and there are some good videos on YouTube about people that did go. And there are books written about it. So no. But the other part of the question is any good stories, experiences you could share. Well, I guess I don't want to take too much time on that because Mike and I have done several videos that specifically address those things. So I would, I guess, refer you to click on the aircrew interview and look at my past videos because I do share a lot of good a lot of good experiences, including how much Mach 2 time I had in the F-111 as a functional check flight pilot, which is kind of interesting, and some of my first red flag mission in the F-111, some of the DACT experiences in the F-16. But I don't want to repeat this everywhere because it is available on Mike's channel. So that's all I'm going to say about this. And there might be some more in the future, but yeah, of course, there were some great stories, as well as some sad stories. With again, I mentioned one of them, but we want to stay positive here, so we'll stay with good stories. So, were you stationed in the UK when the F-111 is connected to Libya raid? Well, yeah, I just addressed that, and then that's from against a big old Tintin. I will pronounce Tintin the French style, okay, because that's my first language. So, in case people don't know. And that explains my accent. So if people are puzzled about my accent, it's because I grew up in France and I ended up learning English in French schools. But yeah, I already addressed that. I did not go on the F-111 raid, but I was in the UK. I was at Lake and Heath. I saw the airplanes take off and land. I did get a Navy Meritorious Unit Commendation Medal that was given to everybody at Lake and Heath. So not just the people getting on the raid, but everybody that was stationed at Lake and Heath at the time of the raid was awarded the Navy. Now this is interesting because that's the only Navy ribbon I have, a Navy medal. Well, it's actually just a ribbon. It's not a medal, but it's a Navy Meritorious Unit Commendation, and that was awarded by the then Secretary of the Navy, Layman, to the entire wing at Lake and Heath. So I do have a souvenir from it, even though I didn't go on the raid. On my uniform, my dress uniform, one of the ribbons on there is the Navy ribbon that was awarded for that raid. Because obviously, the real heroes are the people that went on the raid, but that raid could not have happened without everybody in the wing doing their job, particularly the maintenance, the crew chiefs, the maintenance personnel, the munitions loaders, the munitions builders, the armorers, basically, but everybody on the wing had a part in a way. So, we can't just concentrate. Obviously, the people that went on the raid to risk their lives directly, so they get most of the credit, obviously. And again, we already mentioned that two of them did give their life. I mean, so for that reason, they're the heroes, but they depended on a lot of other people to do their jobs the right way for this raid to be successful. Let's see. Oh yeah, okay. Well, that's a same question. Yeah, that happens. No big deal. Then Big Ol' Stanton, what gave the F-111 such a good range? Did it have CFTs? No. But or did it have the ability to carry external tanks? Well, the last part, yes. And in fact, we rarely flew with external tanks, but it did happen on rare occasions. And we did not need that. Now, the main answer to your question is we had a ton of internal fuel. Now, I'll give you a comparison. Now, the F-111 was a much bigger airplane than the F-16, but just to give you an idea, the internal fuel of the F-16 was about 7,300 pounds of internal gas with no external tanks and no CFTs. The F-111, on the other hand, had 33,000 pounds of internal gas. So like what? More than 4 times as much. Now it had 2 engines, not one, but these were turbofans, so they were pretty. That's the other part of the equation. The TF-30s were the first afterburning turbofans in service on any military aircraft in the world, as opposed to, let's say, the F-4 Phantom that had the J79 turbojet, so no fans. Now, of course, the British version of the F-4 did have turbofans, but that's another story. But the F-111's combination of turbofans and a huge amount of internal fuel made it having long range. Now, the third part of this equation is the swing wing. So, the variable geometry wing, or commonly referred to as swing wing, had some disadvantages, but also had one of the big advantages, and that's the same idea with the Tornado and the Fencer, the Su-24 that we mentioned earlier, is that you could optimize the wing depending on your flight regime to be more efficient for cruise speed, so with the wing more forward. And that did not necessarily mean all the way forward, by the way. The all the way forward situation was more for takeoff and landings. But at cruise speed, you could optimize the wing sweep to have an optimal angle of attack for most optimal cruise speed. You could also optimize it for if instead of range you were worrying about loiter time. Let's say you were in an orbit and you were to maximize the amount of time you could sustain that orbit as opposed to worrying about how far you could go, then you could optimize the wing for that regime as well. If you want to go fast, then you could optimize the wing for that regime. You would obviously put the wing more aft. So that was another big advantage of the swing wing, and that really did help with obtaining maximum range. But again, the F-111 was not the only aircraft that had that. The Tornado and the Su-24 and the F-14, being obvious examples. But the combination of all these factors made for very, very long range. And so with a fuel tank, so no CFTs, no conformal fuel tanks for people who don't know what CFTs mean. So the F-15E and its variants do have conformal fuel tanks. Some of the newer versions of the F-16, the Block 52 plus and above, or Block 50 plus, do have CFTs mounted on the top of the fuselage. But the F-111 did not have those. Now, we did have external fuel tanks. In theory, we could carry 4 600-gallon fuel tanks under the wings. We never flew with more than just 2, because with 4 tanks, I would leave no room for weapons, basically. And really the only mission that we would be configured to carry fuel tanks was the nuclear mission. So when we pulled alert, and I talked about this in our recent video on the aircrew interview about some of my experiences in the F-111, when we pulled nuclear alert at Lakenheath, the aircraft were loaded with 2 B-61s and 2 fuel tanks, 2 external fuel tanks, 600 gallons each. And the fuel tanks were tested once in a while, not so much on most operational mission. It was just to make sure that the fuel tanks did function properly. And occasionally we did have issues with that. So we would fly with the fuel tanks to make sure they fed properly. And usually they did, but occasionally we would find issues with that, and then they would fix it. So that was the main point of flying with the... But at Red Flag, never flew with external tanks. I don't remember flying any mission except like post alert check missions to try out the fuel tanks and make sure they function properly, because we already didn't need to. Most of the time, if we needed to fly longer missions, we would just use air refueling. So we just air refuel and deal with the extra needed time or range in that manner. So I hope that answers the question. Let's see. Next, Big Ol' Tintin again. When you moved from the F-111, did you find it difficult adapting to single-seaters? Not really. I mean, I'll say this. To just fly the airplane around, and in general, no, I did not have a hard time adapting. Part of it was because the F-16, the cockpit, the man-machine interface in the F-16 was way more advanced than in the F-111. So yes, you had to do more tasks by yourself. So in that respect, it made it more difficult. On the other hand, the switchology, as we call it, where the buttons were placed on the throttle and stick, and again, in the F-16 was a side stick, but and where the displays were, and how you could switch displays by just touching button or activate certain functions or switching radar modes, all while never moving your hands from the stick and throttle, was pretty amazing in the F-16. So that helped a lot. Having said that, there were some missions where you kind of wish you had an extra crew member, like a Wizzo, like a low-level night mission, under a high threat. That would have been very, very demanding. And so, it's not a super easy answer, but overall, I did not have a hard time adapting to single-seaters at all. So next question, Freckle Pooney. Was the FB-111 a good idea as a strategic platform for the old Strategic Air Command, or SAC? That's a tough question now. it kind of replaced, the airplane it kind of replaced was the B-58. Um, and there is a lot of controversy as to whether the B-58 was a good aircraft or not for SAC. B-58 was bigger than the FB-111, but no, I knew. In fact, we had when I was flying at F-111As at Mountain Home, and I think at Lake and East also, although not in my squadron, but in a different squadron, we had a couple of exchange pilots on Wizzos from the FB-111 community, um, doing an exchange tour in the TAC, in the tactical Air Force F-111s. And then there was vice versa. No, I never did an exchange tour with SAC, but I know a couple of people who did. So they got to fly the FB-111. And obviously, from a range perspective, the FB-111 is nowhere close to like a B-52 or even a B-1. It also does not carry as much, but it had its advantages and functions of speed, particularly on ingress at low altitude. That's a very difficult question. And I guess, best would be to invite an FB-111, a former FB-111 crew member. And I don't know if Mike has had one of them on the show before. I don't remember that anybody from the, there's been more than one F-111 guest on his show, but personally, I don't remember an FB-111 air crew being interviewed on the show, but I could be wrong. Mike can correct us at the end if I'm wrong. But that would be a better person to answer the question. Obviously, they got rid of it after. I think it did stay in service quite a lot longer than the B-58, but eventually they retired it, and the B-1 took over, which is from that point of view, is much more capable. Although I would notice that the B-1 has not had a nuclear mission for quite a long time now. So, it's now only the B-52 and the B-2 have a nuclear capability. And so the B-1 is purely conventional mission now. So even though it was created with a nuclear mission in mind as well. Next question, Neuropilot. Okay, welcome to the Q&A. Do you think sometimes the brass are sometimes over-restrictive with the training rules? Well, of course, that brings back to a discussion. In the Air Force, I would say maybe yes, although, honestly, the comparison that usually is drawn is between like the U.S. Navy, which is a lot more free willing and less restrictive. I mean, the old joke is in the Navy, if it doesn't say somewhere written down that you cannot do something, then you can do it. In the Air Force, it has to be written down that you can do something, otherwise the assumption is you cannot do it. It's not really true, but there's a little bit of truth to that, I guess, in a broad sense. The Air Force tends to be more restrictive. And I know people that have gotten in trouble for, breaking the rules. I mean, I remember when I was at Lake and Heath, we won't name names, but there was an infamous incident at a EW range in North Scotland called Ben Becula, when the guys, they were asked to do a flyby, kind of like in Top Gun, say, hey, requesting flyby, negative Ghost Rider. But in this case, the range tower at Ben Becula said, yeah, sure, go ahead and do, we'd be more than happy. And they did a low and very fast pass. The only problem is they went a little too fast and ended up going supersonic and breaking every window in that control tower and maybe doing some other damage. And they got into pretty big trouble for this. I mean, they didn't, I don't remember, because it was not in my squadron. And in fact, they transferred the Wizzo into my squadron as a result of that incident. And he was a good guy. But I think the pilot was grounded for at least a while. And I can't remember the exact details. The Wizzo, they didn't punish as hard. But so, yeah, there are restrictions. But of course, breaking windows while going supersonic, I mean, it might sound cool, but it's probably, I mean, you do cause damage to property. So, but there were restrictions, and I don't know. I never felt like they were so smothering that it preventing me from having fun flying either the F-111 or the F-16. So I wouldn't make too much of that. Obviously safety was a concern, but um, typically what would happen if there was an accident, some restrictions would be put temporarily, but eventually they would go away. Now, once in a while, for serious accidents, the restrictions did become permanent, but I would say that's more the exception than the rule. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. I did do a lot of stuff uh, now I can say was kind of like bordering on the rules, infringing, not completely breaking, but having a loose interpretation of the rules. Let's put it that way. And I mean, who knows what could have happened, but I never got in trouble. So anyway, let's say. So now we've got Ian Saxon is asking, evening, gents. Hey, Karl, tell us about how loud the F-111 is again. Well, the F model was definitely very, very well. All F-111s were definitely not quiet. So the F model was significantly louder for sure in full afterburner on takeoff. But I tell you, I wonder, having seen the F-35 demo a few times now, that airplane is super loud, even though it's single engine, but it's got a super powerful, engine, and it is extremely loud. I don't know. I'd have to hear them like, one after the other to be sure. But I wouldn't be surprised if the F-35 or even the F-22 is louder than the F-111. I don't know. I wouldn't bet money on it. But yeah, it was loud. It was loud, definitely. And so because of this, sometimes there were restrictions as to flying hours and whatnot. Let's see. Freckle Puny is today's F-16 with JDAMs and modern targeting and navigation pods as good as or even better than night all-weather platforms than the late 80s F-117. Oh, F-111. I'm sorry. My eyes are getting bad as I'm getting older. Maybe I should have put on my glasses. Anyway, the late 80s F-111. Yeah, no, in many ways, they're way better. I mean, it's not even the F-111 with PaveTac was quite good for the time, but the quality of the video of the PaveTac, again, it was quite good for the time, but you can't compare it to the new pods now. And of course, the new pods are way smaller, way more compact, lighter, more aerodynamic. I mean, you name it. The technology is way better, and also the new pods have daytime camera color TV capability, which of course at night is no good, but during the day, if you're attacking targets during the days, is light years ahead of what we had. The infrared picture on the new pods is way better. I mean, it's you can't even compare it. Now, of course, with GPS, the INS system, the integrated INS GPS systems that they have today. Having Link 16 to JTIDs is a huge advantage that we did not have when I was flying either the F-111 or F-16. But that gives you situation awareness that, assuming everything is working fine, is incomparably better than what we had. So now, I'll say this though. If you're talking a super high threat environment where you are forced to go back down to low altitude at night, I don't know, that would be a tough call. I mean, the lantern system, the lantern pods on the F-16 were designed to allow the F-16 to fly low altitude at night in the weather. So it gave the F-16 sort of an equivalent capability to the terrain following radar of the F-111, with the addition that if the weather was good enough, you had in your heads-up display a presentation of the infrared picture that the navigation pod would give you. So you unlike in the F-111, which was purely a radar, in the F-16 with Lantern, you had a radar presentation, which was somewhat similar to the F-111, but you also had the advantage of a visual presentation in your heads-up display or in one of your multifunction screens. So that would be tough, but honestly, if I had to choose which aircraft to go in bad weather, low altitude at 200 feet in a high threat environment, I think I would pick the F-111 because of the two crews and the being able to share the duties. It might be a tough call, but I think I would pick the F-111. Now, it would be great to have an F-111 with upgraded systems, with modern GPS, INS, and everything, and a more modern pod and everything. That would be fantastic. And of course, the F-111 would have longer range and can carry more weapons too, which would be an advantage. So, the F-16 being much, much smaller than the F-111, even with conformal tanks, it's still nowhere close to the range and weapons carrying capability of the F-111. So in that scenario, if you were forced to low altitude because of SA-20s and whatnot, I guess the F-111 might be better. Let's see. But I think in all other scenarios, I would pick an F-16 with modern systems or an F-15E or something like that. Let's see. Ray Lauterbach asks, dumb bomb performance differences between the F-111 and the F-16. Well, for dumb bombs, yeah, the F-16 was way better. No, obviously the F-111 could carry more of them, but I can tell you it needed to carry more of them because the accuracy in the F-16, even in the F-111F, which was somewhat better system compared to the F-111A, it was like better. It's not even comparable. Now let me caveat that this what I'm talking about right now is in a visual bombing scenario. So I can see the target visually. I can, I'm going to do a dive delivery or a level delivery, but visually on a target, the bomb nav system of the F-16, even back in that era, was way better. And the F-16 system from that era, by the way, was derived from the A7's system. The newer F-16s have completely different systems, so they're even way better. But at the time, the initial F-16 system was derived from the A7, which had a reputation for being very, very good. Now, in an all-weather scenario where you're doing a radar bombing, I have done radar bombing in the F-16. The radar had a lot of advantages, like Doppler beam sharpening. In some scenarios, the radar picture of the F-16 even the F-16 from back in my era was way better than anything we could get in the F-111. The raw radar picture was better in the F-111 just because of raw power, and the dish was bigger. But because of the computer processing capability in the F-16, you could get better radar pictures in a lot of scenarios in the F-16. Now, doing that at low altitude, we're flying on terrain following radar and all that stuff on a single seat aircraft, that would be way more challenging. So, and of course with dumb bombs, so it all goes down to the accuracy of your aiming, whether it's visual or radar, and of course the capability of the computing power of the aircraft and how fast it can compute in a real time. How given in the F-111, the computers, let's say, were pretty good if you did not have to maneuver a lot on the way to the target. If you were able to maintain a constant airspeed, constant flight attitude, towards the target, they were pretty good. But as soon as you would vary your flight path because you were doing, let's say, you were avoiding threats or whatever, the F-16s was way, way, way better. It could compute the corrections way faster. So I would give the advantage overall to the F-16 by far. Next question, back to Neuropilot. Given the F-16 Block 30 performance, do you think the F-16V Block 70 will hold its own for decades or two Let me scroll down a little bit. As a strike fighter, especially for our partners, yeah, no question. The Block 70 is fantastic. I mean, I've never flown it, obviously, but I know quite a lot about it because of my current job. I do work on a contract for the Air Force, for specifically for FMS countries, foreign military sales. So even though my job right now is a program manager on mission planning software for FMS countries that supports F-16 and F-15 variants in about 30 different countries that have bought the F-16 and F-15, including the new Block 70 and the F-16V, which is slightly different. The difference, the F-16V designation can be applied to older variants of the F-16 that have been upgraded with the avionics of the Block 70. So, for example, the Taiwanese Block 20 aircraft, which is already an F-16A, Block 20. They were the only countries with that block, by the way. They've modified all their Block 20s, or at least most of them, to F-16V configuration. So it's not a Block 70 because they keep the old engine. Like the old landing gear, everything is the old F-16 A Block 20. But the avionics, including the radar, so now they have a electronically scanned active array and new cockpit displays, all modernized, different electronic warfare. I mean, all kinds of new stuff. And that's the F-16V. But there is the Block 70 or brand new built aircraft. They are built at the Lockheed Martin Greenville facility in South Carolina. Is it South Carolina or no? Yeah, I think that's right. But as opposed to the Fort Worth, Texas line, which now builds F-35s exclusively. But those have way more powerful engines. In addition to the new avionics, they are able to carry external conformal fuel tanks, so CFTs, on the dorsal mounts, whereas let's say the Taiwanese Block 20s F-16Vs cannot. So there are a lot of differences, but the Block 70 is a fantastic aircraft, awesome capability. The only disadvantage compared to maybe some others, it's not as maneuverable, let's say, as a Eurofighter or maybe the Rafale, because even though the engine's been upgraded and is very powerful, the wing loading has increased because it's the same wing, so it hasn't changed. And so because of the weight being more, the maneuverability obviously overall has been degraded, but maneuverability is certainly still more than good enough. And dogfighting, even though it's really cool and still, not unimportant, in the era of helmet-mounted cueing displays and AIM-9X Block 2s that can shoot backwards, basically. I mean, not technically backwards, but they can do a 180 right after launch and target the guy behind you. Pure maneuverability is not what it used to be. So I'll just leave it at that. Overall, my answer is yes. It's still very relevant. It's good bargain too, compared to some of these other aircraft that are competitive, and that's why it's having a huge amount of success at export. So countries that can't buy the F-35 or maybe can't afford the Eurofighter or the Rafale, they tend to buy the Block 70. And it will be a very good aircraft, no questions. So this MVFR is asking, could the F-111F actually go faster than the published Mach 2.5? Good question. Could some F-111s have the ability to mount AIM-9s on the external pylons? I think I remember seeing photos. Yeah, well, the second question first, yes. Now, they gave us at Lake Anise when I was there, they gave us, I think they were AIM-9Es and then AIM-9Ps, which is a upgrade variants of the E, if I remember well. We never got Limas or Mikes, which would have been a lot better, honestly, for that platform. But okay, at least the short answer is yes, we did. And I think I flew once or twice with captive, no, not with real missiles, but with captive carry AIM-9s just for practice. The ability to use them was pretty rudimentary. I mean, for us, it was basically bore sight only. No off bore sight capability. So, but it was better than nothing. And we rarely flew with even the captive carries. I remember. I think I might have flown once or twice with them. It was not a common occurrence. When I flew at Mountain Home, sometimes we had the gun, the Vulcan gun installed in the bomb bay. But again, I think I've talked about this in previous videos that they did not maintain the gun in working order. So even though sometimes we would carry it, we would never fire it ever, which was kind of frustrating. But then going back to the first part of the question, going Mach 2.5. Now, I've heard stories. Now, I flew above Mach 2 many, many times. I have never gone above Mach 2.5. Now, I believe the aircraft would have been capable of. That is based on several considerations. The max I've gone with the F-111 was about Mach 2.35 at 50,000 feet. But these were on the F model, and these were with derated engines. So what they had done is to prolong the life of the engines, they actually derated the engines to a little bit less thrust than they would be capable of. Now in combat, there was a switch or a circuit breaker or something. This was not accessible from inside the cockpit, mind you. So this would have to be done by maintenance before flight. There was a capability to revert back to full combat power capability. I can't remember if it was a switch or a circuit breaker or some other thing, but you had to actually open a panel on each engine and switch that back to combat power. I believe if you did this and you had a good cold day, and you had absolutely a clean airplane, so no pylons. That's one of the things. When I was doing Mach 2.35, if I remember well, I actually had pylons installed on the wings. So 4 pylons. Now, no racks on the pylons, no multiple ejection racks, or no weapons, no fuel tanks, nothing, but just the pylons. And that would, at that speed, be extra drag. So a completely clean airplane, full combat power, rated engines on a cold day, I'd be willing to put money it could go faster than 2.5. Now, having said that, 2.5 was the limit in the flight manual, but really the limit was the temperature on the windshield. We actually had a temperature readout between the two seats, between the Wizzo and I, looking backwards. So we had a temperature gauge, and I can't remember. I'd have to look at the manual. But above a certain temperature, there was a 5-minute maximum limit above that, and then there was a absolute do not exceed temperature. Now again, what that would equate to, and I've seen it go above on some of my Mach 2 flights, if I remember. I have seen it go above the, not exceed 5 minutes above that limit. I don't remember ever seeing it getting close to the maximum limit. But I bet you it could do it, in particularly the F model. But again, I know I've heard stories, but I've heard people that told me that they did it. So, I cannot confirm or deny, but and supposedly, part of what they had to do this was to actually climb a little bit higher than we're supposed to, and then put it in a slight nose dive. Not a real dive or a steep dive, but so very slight nose down, and then they were able to go above. But again, I can't say for sure. I never did it myself. I can tell you that for sure. but I believe it would have been able to. Could the F-111 Super Cruise in the clean configuration? Yes. Now, somewhat caveat, I mean, you would have to have no more than just pylons on board. So with any kind of ordnance or fuel tank or anything, I don't think it would have been able to do it. But and then the other caveat was I do think you would have had to put, particularly with the derated engines, like I just mentioned, you would have had to punch through the Mac using afterburner, not full afterburner, but some afterburner. And then once you're above, you could bring it back to mill power, and you would have been to Super Cruise. Now, not at 1.6 Mach like an F-22 can do, okay? But at 1.2, yes, definitely you could do it. And I guess, people on the Typhoon said that it can do the same thing. Maybe the Rafale too, I don't know. But again, it's true if you don't have a lot of stuff hanging on the wings. Did you ever get a ride in a Tornado or F-14? That's a Neuropilot asking that. And no. And boy, particularly the F-14, I wish I could have. That was kind of like my dream airplane growing up. And I ended up going Air Force. And even then, you could still, there are Air Force pilots. They ended up flying the F-14 as an exchange pilot with the Navy for a few years. But I love the F-14. I've made no secret about this. And, but Tornado, no. I would have been interested, of course. I got a ride. I mentioned in one of my previous aircrew interview videos that I got a ride in the backseat of a Belgian Mirage 5 fighter in Belgium during a squadron exchange, and that was super interesting. And I would have loved to. I love aviation in general. So you give me a ride in just about anything, I'll take it. But the F-14, yes. Tornado, I absolutely would have loved to. Either a GR4 or an F3, doesn't matter. Give me a ride in any aircraft. Now on the Tornado, obviously I would have preferred, if I would have gotten a ride, to be in one of the two, the models with two sticks, because most Tornadoes, the way I understand it, did not have a stick in the back. The F-14, none of them did. So that would be a disadvantage as far as being a pilot, not being able to experience actually, getting a feel for the handling characteristics of the aircraft, just going along for the ride. That would have been a negative. But the Tornado did have some twin stick trainers, so that would have been great. But no, did not, unfortunately. Tell you another aircraft I would have loved to fly in, the F-4 Phantom. To me, that's an absolute classic airplane, and I would have loved to have gotten a ride in an F-4, but unfortunately, never did. So let's see. Freckle Pooney says or asks, I read in Air Force Monthly years ago. Hey, Air Force Monthly, highly recommended. I subscribe to it, and I also subscribe to Combat Aircraft magazine, and these are fantastic publications, highly recommended. Anyway, so I read there that Israel was offered surplus F-111s. Without going into politics, given the F-111's range, how would this have been? Would this have altered the strategic balance? Well, I've never heard that story. Honestly, I've been subscribing. If you saw it in the Air Force's Monthly, I would love to have the reference of the exact article. But okay, never mind. I believe you. And it's certainly possible. I've never heard about it. If they had F-111s, sure, it would have altered the strategic balance because of the range. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, I'm not sure what time frame this was in. Obviously, the F-111, one of its major disadvantages and one of the main reasons it was eventually retired, both from the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, was it was not an easy and cheap aircraft to maintain compared to the newer aircraft. So it did require a lot of maintenance, a lot of personnel, and then also, parts obsolescence. So it became harder and harder to find spare parts for these things. Some of it can be taken care of by cannibalizing, which is basically taking parts from aircraft that you're never going to fly again. They're like at Davis Mountain or something, at the aircraft cemetery there, the boneyard, and just using them to put on flyable aircraft. But overall, I think Israel, one of their things is trying to look for things that are not too hard to maintain, and I think from that point of view, the F-111 would not have been a good fit for them. But sure, from a range and ordnance carrying capability, yeah, sure, it would have been. I think a lot of Arab countries in the area would have been pretty upset if that would have happened. I think, uh,
So, Carl, just
particularly
to
if we,
jump in here, do you want to answer maybe 2 or 3 more questions to wrap up this
yes,
brilliant Q&A?
yeah, sure. I'll do 2 or 3 depending on how long I know I tend to be long winded sometimes, so I apologize for that. Some people like that I'm pretty thorough in my answers, but on the other hand, yeah, it does limit what we can do. All right, so let's see. Neuropilot asks, yeah, a friend told me about got a call from the one-star commander because 2 U.S. Air Force F-22 pilots did a 1.2 Mach flyby, and my friend, DoD civilian, Navy-ish NATOPS F-18 was like, oh yeah, that flyby. Well, yeah, I mean, particularly in the F-22, I could see how easily it's easy to lose track of how fast you're going, because that thing can go like a bat out of hell. I mean, it's just crazy thrust, and super slam obviously can super cruise. So I've heard, I mean, inadvertently, even in a black, even in any F-16, you had to be very careful during the ACT engagements. Now, these were at higher altitudes, medium to high altitudes, above 10,000 feet for sure. And it never happened to me, but, it happened to other people, losing track of how fast you're going in a DACT engagement. And, while you're pulling, 7, 9 Gs, you're not going to go supersonic for sure. But as soon as you unload to regain airspeed, if you're not paying attention, it'd be really easy to go supersonic pretty quick, particularly in a big mouth Block 50 F-16. And I've heard that it's happened inadvertently. People, they keep track of where the simulated enemies are and not looking at their airspeed, and then suddenly the next thing they know, they're supersonic. Now, not a huge deal if you're at a high altitude. That people are going to hear a boom on the ground, but you're probably not going to cause damage or anything. But at low altitude, yeah, that would be much more of a problem. Anyway, and Europilot again asks, this is kind of a continuation, I guess. This was in a restricted area, so no damage. Technically, Mach 1.2 was authorized. Oh, okay, well, yeah. If you're, like at red flag, we were authorized to go supersonic in most of the areas. Now, there were some specific, restricted areas where you could not. But, I did mention in some of the earlier videos about me going like 1.4 Mach on the deck, aggressing a target at red flag, and no big deal. Yeah, it's really fun. You can see the shockwave on the ground and everything. But yeah, you are authorized. There are circumstances where it's perfectly legal to do that. I also remember doing supersonic intercept in Germany when I was at home flying the F-16. And actually, that's the fastest speed I got in the F-16 was 1.7 Mach, which was kind of, pretty impressive because I was carrying a centerline tank. And the weather was so bad on that day that we couldn't do a low altitude. It was basically sucked in from ground to like 30,000 feet. So we couldn't do anything, but we were airborne. So, 2-ship, and we ended up doing, supersonic intercepts. And at the time, we were authorized to go supersonic. This is Cold War days. We were able in Germany to go supersonic above a certain altitude, and I can't remember what it was, but definitely at 30,000, we were okay. And so there was me against my my leader, or I can't remember if I was leading the mission. I think I was still a wingman at the time on that mission, and doing intercepts on the supersonic target while you yourself are supersonic. So, and I'll reach 1.7 Mach, I think, something like that, or very close to it. And that's the fastest I've ever been in the F-16. But this was perfectly legal. I don't know if it would still be legal today, though, in the post-Cold War days, a lot more restrictions. In Europilot, Oh, this he's answering. Yeah, he's answering somebody else's question, so I'm not going to cover that. Talking about the F-15E having a lot more thrust. F-15EX. The F-15E, by the way, there's two types, right? So there's some of the 220 engine, some of the 229 engine, which is way more powerful, and so not all F-15Es are created equal in that respect. And your pilot, okay, well, he's more these things are not questions, more like comments. So talking about some of the newer designation pods and everything. Yeah, good comments. I agree with them, but I'm not going to repeat them here. Oh yeah, so Big Ol' Stanton asked, "Did you ever perform a dump and burn?" And, obviously, that's an F-111 question for people who don't know, but I'm sure people have seen, particularly Australian Air Force, doing a dump and burn. So that's when you dump fuel. The fuel dump mass in the F-111 is right behind the two, in between the two engines, in the back of the airplane. So you can dump fuel. So that's something you could not do in the F-16. By the way, there is no dumping capability in the F-16. Not that you already need it, but anyway. But the F-111 could dump fuel. And then if you go afterburner while you're dumping fuel, then it ignites the fuel that's being dumped, and you have this huge flame that's about 2 or 3 times the length of the F-111 trailing behind you. And yes, I have done this. Now, technically, in the U.S. Air Force, you were only allowed to do it in case of an emergency. But a couple of times. I remember one specific time I was flying F-111As at Mountain Home, and we were doing a night trail departure. So we take off with like 30-second spacing with my wingman behind me, 30 seconds or maybe a minute behind, or maybe it was a minute behind. And he's supposed to rejoin. And this was more like a dusk. It was night, so it was after sunset, but it was still a tiny bit of daylight. And he couldn't acquire me on his radar. And the F-111 radar was not very good in air-to-air. Now, he did have some capability, and we locked on air-to-air targets a few times, but definitely not the best. And he had trouble picking me up on his radar. And so my Wizzo was a very experienced Wizzo. I was still a very young lieutenant at the time. But he said, "Hey, watch this. You're going to pick us up." And he started dumping fuel a little bit, and he said, "Karl, go after burner." And I went after burner, and a big flame, and the immediate response from the wingman was, "Oh, okay, I got you." Visual, no problem. So that's one of the stories, but I could tell more stories, and if you want, there is a funny one. So one of my another young pilot at Mountain Home in the same squadron did a dump and burn at night flying low level when he was single ship, but another airplane saw him do it. Now he didn't think he'd be seen, but the next morning I think it was the squadron commander or the DO called him in the office, called the crew in the office, and said, "Hey, what were you guys doing at this time, at low level? Were you there at this time, at this altitude, in this region of IR? It was a low level route that was night capable." And I said, "Yes, yes." I said, "Well, a farmer from that area said that he saw a huge flame thing coming over his farm, and some of his cows got so frightened that he died of a heart attack, and now he's suing the Air Force for like $50,000 for damages, and apparently you were the ones doing this." And of course, these guys are like, "Oh my God, this is bad." Well, it turns out, yeah, they had to be seen, but this was all a bogus story, and the squadron commander was just trying to pull one over them, and no cows had died or anything, but it was apparently, I wasn't in the room, but I would have given everything to be in the room to see this guy's reaction. And after a few minutes, of course, they told him, "Hey, no harm done, but don't do it again." So anyway, I hope people enjoyed that story. I won't mention the guy's name, but he was a fantastic pilot. I ended up going to the fighter weapons school. and retired, I think, as a 2-star general in the Air Force. So it did not hurt his. And he ended up flying the F-16 as well at Lakenheath when I was there in a different squadron, and in the 493rd. And so he had a good career. So it didn't, talking about, is the brass too hard when you break the rules? Yeah, well, I'll go back to this. You're not supposed to break them, but it wasn't that bad. At least back then. I can't talk about the Air Force today. Might be different. I don't know. But back then, we did have some leeway, and I think that was a pretty funny story. Anyway, one more. What do you say, Mike? Or
yeah, go for one more, Karl.
Somebody said, it's New York. I thought the Taiwanese Black 20 was actually Black 25. No, they're Black 20s. You can check it out. And they're the only country that got Black 20s, by the way. So I'm quite certain of my facts here. Let's see. Well, I'm looking at comments rather than I'm looking for an actual question here, because a lot of them are just comments. I'm flying the F4. Yeah. Thank you for service. Okay, so here's a question, Lone Wolf, because we haven't taken one of his questions yet. So he asked, could the F-111 fly with one wing in the forward position and one fully swept? Oh, I know the F-14, they did do that during test flights to see what it would do, and it could. I mean, honestly, the straight answer is I don't know. I don't think it's ever happened. They did train you, or one of the emergency procedures was how to land if the wings were stuck all the way back, and that was possible. Actually, the landing speed would be way faster, but it was possible. And of course, you always had the arrestor cable, the hook, to slow you down in case you had to. But honestly, I don't know of any instance when it's happened. I don't know that the F-111 has been ever tested in that configuration. I know the F-14 was, but I believe it probably could have been able to do that. To just fly, to just fly around. I'm pretty sure it could have. Now to land it in that configuration, I'm kind of really doubtful. But I honestly, I don't have any good data to base this on. It's just my guess that I don't think you could have landed it with that configuration. And then finally, I'll take one more, and that's a Freckle Pony. How did the F-111 handle at high altitude? Straight answer, not very well. So the F-111F better because of the extra thrust, but honestly, there were times, like in the A model, especially at certain altitudes where you had to do air refueling. It was very difficult because we were high enough that, particularly if you had any kind of ordnance, you either had to ask the tanker to go down to a lower altitude, but sometimes you couldn't because your block of altitude was set. And so what you could do was ask the tanker to do what was called a toboggan air refueling, and that's when the tanker just slightly goes into a very, very shallow dive, like maybe 1 degree nose down, and that was enough to help us do the air refueling. And then as a last resort, you just had to put one engine in minimum afterburner and use the other engine to modulate your thrust, which was not optimal. But if you got a lot above 25,000 feet in the A model, yeah, the handling already was not that good. Now, the lighter you got, the better it got. Like as you would burn fuel, it would make a significant difference. As I mentioned earlier, the maximum internal fuel was about 33,000 to 34,000, depending on the type of fuel you had. Like JP8 had a different weight than JP4, for example. But I think with JP8, I think it was closer to 34,000. But anyway, so as you would burn fuel, like if let's say you got down to 10,000 fuel internal fuel, then of course your maneuverability at higher altitude got a lot better, and then you did not have these problems with air refueling and so on. But the F model was a little bit better. I would say it was okay to about 30,000, but again, above that, unless you were supersonic. Now, of course, I flew at 50,000 feet, but I was going like way supersonic, including above Mach 2. And supersonic, it actually handled pretty well, but of course, your fuel burn rate was super high, so you couldn't do it forever. So anyway, but yeah, overall, the Tornado, by the way, has the same problem, same issue. Maybe a little less in the F3 model, but the Tornado GR4 and the early GR1, the earlier models, yeah, same issue. Not good at all at high altitude. These airplanes were definitely way more comfortable low down. So anyway. So, Mike, is that it? I mean, I know there are more questions, and I could go on forever. Just kind of a passion of
I
mine, and
think
I love.
we can have one more question here, Carl. I think sorry if I pronounce this wrong. If you say it as a Barocas mark, which aircraft for one last flight? I think that would be a great wrap up for this
Which
Q&A.
aircraft for one last flight? Yeah, I think I mentioned that in my last video with you. That if you had an F-111 and F-16, well, it's okay. Now, I don't know if the question referred to, which aircraft between the 111 or F-16 or any aircraft at all. So if it's meant as between F-16 and F-111, I think I already answered that. It would be a tough choice, but it would be the F-16. Just because I love both aircraft, don't get me wrong, but F-16 is just that bubble canopy and just the thrust and the maneuverability. And now the advantage of a flight in the F-111 is it could be a longer flight. I could do a 3-hour flight in the F-111. In the F-16, it might only be like a 1 hour, an hour and a half, depending on what I do. But yeah, I would take the F-16. Now, if it was any aircraft whatsoever, now assuming I was qualified in it, because there are no two-seaters, but the F-22 would be my. I mean, I don't know. That'd be a tough choice. I mean, F-14. That's a tough one. I don't know. The F-14 would be
conflicted there, Carl.
I am conflicted. Now, in the F-14, I would say it would have to be in the front seat. Okay, so the back seat would be kind of cool, but no, it would have to be in the front seat, and then it would definitely the F-22 of the F-20, the F-14. With the F-35 would be my next choice after that, but I guess I'll say the F-14, just because I just loved that airplane when I was growing up. It still holds. If you can see the background, I have a huge model of an F-14.
Yeah.
Still, I think, yeah, that airplane to me is just a fantastic airplane. So I'm gonna say the F-14 if it wasn't the F-16 or F-111.
Brilliant.
But hopefully it would be a B or a D model.
Yeah, you don't want the TF, right?
Well, I mean, I would fly any F-14, but if I was given the choice, I would
the big
take.
motors.
I wouldn't care if it was the B or D. Actually, I just want the big engines.
Great stuff. Well, guys, thank you very much who joined us in the chat today and put the questions. It was a great Q&A. And yeah, Carl, thank you very much for coming on the show. Always a pleasure. I'm sure we're going to have you back on because you're a great guest. Loads of stories. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime you want. So I could go on forever with this stuff. I'm not only I was a pilot in the Air Force, but I'm also a very keen aviation history enthusiast, and I have tons of books about and models, as you can see. But so I could go on forever talking about airplanes.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And yeah, I'm sure we're going to get you back on the show again. But yeah, thanks again to everyone who joined us tonight. And thank you to Carl. So cheers, mate. And yeah, we'll speak soon.
Cheers. All right. Okay. I'll be in touch.